Theme 22, Multi-word verbs. Index. 1. Introduction. 2. Relation with other themes. 3. Current legislation. 4. Definition of multi-word verbs. 5. Different particles used, adverbs and prepositions. 6. Phrasal verbs. 7. Free combinations. 8. Prepositional verbs. 9. How to distinguish between transitive phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs. 10. Conclusion applicable to language teaching. 11. Relevant bibliography. The theme I have chosen to write about is number 22, which deals with the concept of multi-word verbs. In the first place, I will briefly explain what multi-word verbs are and the different particles they use. I will then go on to talk about the various types of phrasal and prepositional verbs and the different criteria we can use to distinguish between them. I will conclude with some thoughts on how best to approach the teaching and learning of these verbs in our secondary school classes. This theme is directly related to others, in particular numbers 19 to 23 and 25 to 27, which cover different aspects regarding verbs in English, and also number 12, which deals with the concept of grammar and how to deal with this in our classes. The new improved organic law of education, the LOMLOE, came into force in 2021 and has now been introduced in secondary education. The law deals comprehensively with the most suitable type of methodology to be implemented in our secondary school classes. The official curriculum of the Autonomous Community of Madrid contains detailed information about the introduction of grammatical points during the different stages of compulsory secondary education and bachillerato. All of this is established and supported by the Council of Europe in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. As an introduction, I would say that most multi-word verbs are those combinations of verb plus adverb or preposition which behave to some extent as a single unit, either lexically or syntactically. In a sentence like, they turned down his application, the word turn is morphologically a verb, but turn down functions as a single unit with the meaning rejected. Consequently, turn down is one of the many thousands of combinations in the English language which we know of as multi-word verbs. Other multi-word verbs include constructions like verb-adjective combinations, as in lie low, or verb-verb combinations like get going, or verbs followed by two prepositions such as apply to someone for something. What most of us studied at school or in university as phrasal verbs are, in fact, a mixture of phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs. It is sometimes extremely difficult to distinguish between these two types, since many particles can function either as prepositions or adverbs, as occurs with past or down. In the sentence John fell down, we can see that down is functioning as an adverb. If we change the sentence to John fell down the stairs, however, we now see that down is functioning as a preposition. The most obvious difference, naturally, is that prepositions require a prepositional complement, whereas adverbs do not. It is important at this stage to mention yet again that a verb followed by a preposition or adverb is only considered to be a multi-word verb when, as I previously said, it behaves to some extent as a single unit, either lexically or syntactically. Thus, Mary walked down the street is simply a verb walked followed by a prepositional phrase, down the street. The first type of these multi-word verbs we have to consider is that of phrasal verbs. They consist of a verb plus an adverb article, as in the sentence, my mother turned up without warning. Many of these phrasal verbs take a direct object and may be described as transitive. An example of a phrasal verb with a direct object would be, the miners have called off their strike. In this case, the particle can either precede or follow the direct object, so we could just as easily find the miners have called their strike off. Indeed, if the object is a personal pronoun, the verb must be separated from the particle, as in, I switched it on. If, on the other hand, the direct object is a longer noun phrase, as in, I switch on the light which the electrician had installed for me, it would be stylistically awkward to move the adverb particle on to the end of the sentence, even though it would be correct. Reiterating what I have mentioned above, we must not confuse phrasal verbs with what we know of as free combinations. An example of a free combination could be something like walked past, as in Tony walked past the shop. Here, past is functioning like any other prepositional phrase of direction. The verb walked can also be substituted by many other dynamic verbs of motion, such as ran or hurried. The second main group of these multi-word verbs we need to examine are prepositional verbs. They consist of a verb plus a preposition with which it is semantically and or syntactically associated. An example would be, I must go into the problem, where go into has the meaning of investigate. It is extremely important here to realize that the noun phrase following this particular type of multi-word verb is not, as we might think, the direct object of the verb, but rather a prepositional complement. However, some prepositional verbs can be followed by two noun phrases, normally separated by the preposition. In these cases, the first noun phrase is the direct object, and the second is the prepositional complement. An example of this type of prepositional verb would be, he invested his money in charity. Here, his money is the direct object and charity the prepositional complement. In order to try to distinguish between transitive phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs, we can try to use two criteria. In the first place, if it is possible to move the particle to a position following the noun phrase, as I pointed out before, then the combination is a phrasal verb. Thus, in the sentence, she called up her mother, or she called her mother up, called up, meaning telephoned, is instantly identifiable as a phrasal verb, whereas the sentence, she called on her mother, does not have the same possibility of moving the particle to the end. Therefore, called on, meaning visited, is a prepositional verb. The second criterion we can use is that of stress. In a phrasal verb, the adverb particle is stressed, while the preposition is never stressed in a prepositional verb. Using the same examples as we saw before, we would hear, she called her mother up with the adverb up stressed, and she called on her mother with no stress on the preposition on. I have to say, though, that this rule is not much use to us when we have a preposition of more than one syllable, as in across or together, as these words are automatically stressed on the strong syllable. Phrasal prepositional verbs are a further major category of multi-word verbs which contain, in addition to the lexical verb, both an adverb and a preposition as particles. These combinations are largely restricted to informal English. Typical examples would be, I am really looking forward to your wedding, or I will not put up with your criticism much longer. As a conclusion, I would say that most students, and to be honest, probably most teachers as well, have a deep-rooted fear of the whole idea of multi-word verbs, and for that very reason, do their very best to avoid using them. The typical system employed by so many teachers of obliging students to learn long lists of these verbs by heart is a guaranteed recipe for disaster. It is much more sensible to allow students to see or hear these verbs in context, deduce their meaning from that context, and then be confident enough to use them orally or in writing. The bibliography I have used for the information in this theme has basically been a comprehensive grammar of the English language by Quirk, Greenbaum, Swartbeck, and Leake. I hope you agree with me that my theme has covered all the necessary points and that it has demonstrated the importance of dealing with grammatical concepts in arts classes from a student-centered viewpoint, using up-to-date methodological principles, something which can only be of benefit to our students.